Welcome back to the Life of Buddha Shakyamuni video series. In episode 19, we learned about the Anatta Sutra, in which the Buddha taught about the five aggregates. After preaching the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the Buddha continued his teachings to the first five monks with the discourse on non-self. He explained that the five aggregates, form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness, are not me, not mine, and not myself. The Buddha emphasized that all phenomena are impermanent, but not all lead to suffering, dukkha. Suffering only arises when people cling to the five aggregates, seeing them as me or mine. The Buddha advised his disciples to contemplate to see clearly the egoless nature of the five aggregates, thereby letting go of attachment and attaining liberation. He emphasized that when there is no more craving or desire for the five aggregates, the practitioner will be free from all bondage and attain the state of nirvana. After hearing this sermon, the five monks deeply understood the doctrine of non-self and attained arahantship. This event marked the birth of the first five holy disciples, creating a solid foundation for the early Buddhist church. Episode 20, The First Rains Retreat, the Buddha and his first disciples. After only a few early rains, the area had become muddy and wet. The Buddha discussed with the five monks that they should repair and restore the huts and the walking paths so that they could settle down here until they could find a more suitable place. Because they were used to the ascetic life, they considered these tasks as just a rest and recuperation. They went to find trees and leaves, and fortunately, the cowherd children happily came to help. A few days later, the thatched roofs and walls were thickly packed to block out heavy rain and strong winds. In addition, they also woven some grass cushions and made more wooden beds. The Buddha's leaf hut was now quite spacious, with enough beds and cushions, and the ground was lined with trees and quite clean. While they were working, the children brought earthenware jars of water, big and small, to give to the monks. So, on the left side of the porch, they worked hard to get stones to pave the floor and placed water jars to make a place for the Buddha to wash his feet. They also made quite spacious walking paths between the rows of trees. There were natural rocks here and there that they repaired and swept to make a place for open-air meditation. Everything looked comfortable, like an ideal forest retreat. The scene seemed even more peaceful and serene when deer of all colors, big and small, leisurely grazed or curiously looked at the harmless people with their big round eyes. The days and months passed slowly. The new monks and arahants took turns going out for alms, living and contemplating the teachings they had learned, while at the same time remaining happy in meditation and happy in the results. Every few days, they would bring back relatively good pieces of cloth. They would wash them, dry them, and collect roots and tubers to dye them into a faded color. Whatever looked best, they would offer to the Buddha. They would also take the trouble to cut and dye other small pieces of cloth to wrap around themselves when they wanted to bathe in the rain. Kondanya said to his fellow monks, "We seem to have escaped from our bodies and become new people. The great path has been seen, and what needs to be done has been done." The Buddha's teachings are like a sun, shining on thousands of years of darkness of traditional sects. In the future, some wise people in the world will come to study and practice. That is a truth that does not need to be predicted. So the old robes and bowls that have been thrown away, we must wash, fumigate, and dye them again to save for our friends who will come after us. So they got busy while there were still some sunny days left. The Buddha seemed to spend all his time in sitting meditation and walking meditation. However, few people know that he often returned to near concentration, used his mind to focus on the mind, and rearranged the foundation of the Dharma, dividing it into three periods: initial goodness, intermediate goodness, and final goodness. Initial goodness is the initial foundation for all those who are practicing, regardless of whether they are human or celestial. Intermediate goodness is for those who have seen the Dharma and have entered the stream. And final goodness is for saints who have attained the fruit of Arhat. The Buddha used skillful means to establish a number of teachings suitable for these three periods. For initial goodness, it talks about giving, keeping precepts, blessings of the heavenly realms, nurturing faith and worldly duties and worldly ethics, depending on roles and positions in society. For intermediate goodness, in addition to the foundational teachings of initial goodness, this foundation also needs to learn and practice meditation and insight to quiet or cut off some more binding fetters. The latter are the unlearned ones, no longer learning how to eliminate afflictions, but they will be free birds in the sky, later flying everywhere to transform and save sentient beings according to circumstances. So what they need to learn is to be proficient and familiar with the ways of walking, speaking, how to use the four requisites, how to speak the Dharma, preach the Dharma. In other words, the latter must demonstrate a life of few desires, contentment, and other expedient wisdom. There is also a truth that not everyone can preach the Dharma or give a sermon. And so, each unlearned one will teach sentient beings through his own life of liberation, through his own precepts, meditation, virtue, the four immeasurable minds, or through the Dharma he has learned. However, these so-called expedient wisdoms are very dangerous. Everything is expedient, and the sect leaders and teachers often use expedients to seek fame and profit for themselves. The end justifies the means, and therefore, the means that are implemented are difficult to distinguish between right and wrong, good and evil. This boundary is very fragile. The disciples of Tathagata in the future, when coming to this world, Tathagata must establish standards for this boundary when applying skillful means to save living beings. That is, the skillful means must benefit oneself and others. Benefiting oneself is to make oneself ignorant of greed, anger, and delusion, and move towards enlightenment and liberation. And benefiting others must also have the same goal. The Buddha still needed to spend a long time using his analytical mind to develop each point, each word, each sentence from the two important sermons, the Dharmakakavartin and Anatta. All 5 newly ordained monks were of noble Brahmin lineage, with solid knowledge and learning, yet it took many days to comprehend the teachings, let alone the masses who had limited and low levels of knowledge, sometimes with little intelligence, little education, or no education at all. The Kshatriya class, such as kings, royalty, nobles, generals, and warriors, were often educated, had a level of knowledge that was easy to absorb and teach, but warriors were just like ordinary people. The Brahmin class had now declined, except for religious leaders, ordained priests, noble families, and Brahmin families who owned large, wealthy farms, whose children were well educated. The majority of the laity in this class were also poor and illiterate. The Vaishya class, which included merchants and other professions in society, had now risen to become the masters of the treasury, the presidents of trade unions, the masters of a profession, the great merchants who controlled the economic and social lifeblood. They had naturally entered the aristocracy to become high-ranking officials, economic advisors to the cantons, towns, and the royal court. Some wealthy families in this class hired Brahmin tutors to teach at home, so their children's knowledge and education were equivalent to that of the Kshatriya class. The majority of the laborers and craftsmen in other professions were poor and illiterate. The Shudra class, who did hard, heavy manual labor, were completely ignorant. As for the casteless and slave castes, they are on the fringes of society. Their lives are considered to be a life of hard labor, doing dirty work and being despised, spat upon, and trampled upon by society, worse than animals. Although they are inferior to the upper castes in every aspect, if they have the affinity and the foundation from previous lives, they can help some people drink the pure water of the Dharma. In short, regardless of the group, if they have the affinity, they can be saved first. If they do not have the affinity, they cannot. So the outline of the Dharma does not change, but depending on the level and foundation of living beings, the Dharma can be applied appropriately. Varanasi was originally a river port, where trading ships from the north and west of the Ganges River poured in. It was also the confluence of the Varuna and Asi rivers, which later became the name of the city. Since ancient times, Varanasi has been a bustling and prosperous economic and commercial city. This place is famous for its fine woods, rich fabrics, exquisite silk, thick brocade woven with gold threads, real gold, favored by the rich and noble people inside and outside the continent. When the life of the urban class became prosperous, it led to the development of religion, the emergence of a number of industrial occupations, and other business lines. The Brahmin sects chose this prosperous land as their capital. Thus, palaces, temples, and hermitages sprang up like mushrooms. Religious businesses flourished. Potters and bronze caster workers produced large and small vessels to hold the sacred water soma used in ablutions and sprinkling ceremonies. The trade in agarwood, basil, star anise, and other compatible fuels for the sacrifices to the fire god, the river god, the mountain god, the banyan tree god, and millions of other gods flourished. The animal and fruit sacrifices and cremations on the banks of the Ganges River were indispensable, and garland makers began to be considered a high-income profession. Those who made firewood and fuel for cremations had jobs, and oh my, what services related to priests, altars, crematoriums, pilgrims pulling carriages, boats, motels, inns, guides, food and drink, had the opportunity to compete to serve. With money, silver, business travelers, rich and poor families, there are certainly taverns, brothels, drinking and gambling, prostitutes, and luxurious and decadent enjoyment. Such is the general realistic background of Varanasi. There was a wealthy merchant. He was probably the head of a silk trading association with extensive trade with camel caravans, following the trade route to Egypt, Arabia, Greece, the western regions, and even to China. Yasa was the only son of the wealthy man, and was treated like a jewel by his family, and was pampered since childhood. Many Brahmin teachers served as tutors to train him to become a good person. Whatever he wanted, he got. When he came of age, Yasa was loved by his wealthy father, who built him 3 palaces suitable for the 3 seasons, similar to Prince Siddhartha. In addition to his main wife, who was well-matched, rich, beautiful, and kind, Yasa was always surrounded by dozens of young concubines, dozens of beautiful singers and musicians to entertain him, with wine, tea, music, dancing, and lavish banquets. Living such a life of royal enjoyment, Yasa was often unhappy. He was always worried and sad. The other day, waking up in the middle of the night, after a tiring party, he saw the concubines, dancers, and singers with their clothes off, their perfumes dripping, sleeping soundly, snoring, drooling, looking like a pile of rotten meat, truly disgusting. Frightened, bored, and extremely disgusted, Yasa did not have time to change his nightgown, just hurriedly put on his gold-embroidered velvet slippers, opened the door, and escaped as if escaping an evil obsession, a stinking, dirty prison. Yasa walked as if in a dream, his mouth constantly muttering, "Oh, what a miserable me! What a miserable me! What a tortured me! How horrible I am! How filthy I am!" Yasa kept muttering and walking aimlessly. That night, the sky was cloudy but dry, the stars were dim. Yasa's aimless footsteps led him to Deer Park at dawn. Fortunately for Yasa, at the end of the 3rd watch, his confused, bored state of mind and wandering steps fell into the Buddha's net of mindfulness. And he clearly saw that he was a good fortune not only for himself, but also for the early steps of the Dharma. The Buddha, at that time, was at the end of the walking path, hearing Yasa's lamentations. Clearly seeing Yasa's extreme psychological suffering, he used his supernatural power, gently sending the sound of his voice, penetrating straight into Yasa's mind and heart, like a ray of light in the deep dark night, like a drop of clear and sweet water in the desert, and also like a mother speaking to her child full of tolerance and love. "Yasa, my son, in this place there is no misery, no suffering, no damnation, nothing to be feared and nothing filthy to be avoided. Yasa, my son, come here, sit down here, the Tathagata will talk to you." Like a wake-up call, Yasa was startled as if he had just left a long dream. Coming out of the forest, in the distance, the shadow of a monk appeared in the mist. Yasa gently took off his shoes, threw them aside, and walked barefoot, cautiously walking forward. The Buddha smiled and pointed to a rock. "Sit down here, Yasa, and you will taste the flavor of peace, serenity, and immaculate joy." Then, with his perfect Sanskrit voice, with his gentle, rich, extensive, and profound wisdom, the Buddha slowly, sentence by sentence, word by word, and meaning by meaning, guided Yasa's mind and intellect into the brilliant and glorious realm of the Dharma. At first, he spoke of the dangers of a life of debauchery, which would destroy the body, sap vitality, and dull the mind, gradually losing its sharpness and flexibility. Indulging in a life of sensual pleasures only brings boredom and disgust, but fortunately for those who have escaped from that filthy quagmire. The nature of life is dukkha. It has 2 aspects, suffering and pleasure, good and bad, tears and smiles. but they are often mixed together, contained in each other, dissolved in each other, and sometimes they are two opposing categories. If we strive to seek pleasure through the eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and mind, we will face endless suffering. There is a pair of blue, clear eyes that look at everything, beyond and beyond suffering and happiness, the two sides of the nature of life. It is peaceful and pure. Let your mind and intellect be awake to communicate and contact with all things, then that new, mysterious reality will appear. And then look. The sky, the earth, the mist, the mountains and rivers, the grass and trees, all are peaceful and untroubled. They are all complete as they are. Birds sing, flowers bloom, yellow leaves, green leaves, the moon rises, the moon sets, all are perfect and complete. When our mind is gloomy and sad, everything is gloomy and sad. When our mind is pure and happy, everything is pure and happy. The mind and the scene are interdependent and interactive. Depending on the way of looking, reality as it is will transform into this side or that side. Don't be immersed or bored on this side, but don't be restless, dreaming of the other side. Either side is the change, transformation, and disguise of dukkha. As a wise man, as a sage, one must stand on the top of a 1,000-foot palm tree, step out of the confinement, the maze of that net of Maya. When living in the world of relationships, walking with one's limited bare feet, the dependent origination of suffering and happiness is always inevitable. Then suffering comes, we are swept away by suffering. Happiness comes, we are swept away by happiness, and that is birth and death, the king of demons, sorrow, lamentation, and grief. The Tathagata has a map, a path to escape from that maze, out of that net of Maya, out of that place of suffering and misery, my child Yasa. Do you want to hear it? Being wise upon hearing this, Yasa immediately understood and believed that there was such a path. He knelt down, joyful, filled with tears, and prostrated himself. He embraced the dusty feet of the world-honored one and earnestly spoke, wanting to hear the path to immortality. At that time it was drizzling. The Buddha led Yasa to his incense chamber. The 5 holy monks who knew the story also came to wait around and listen to the Dharma. The Buddha saw that Yasa's mind was stable, so he slowly, kindly, step by step, using convenient means, preaching about charity, keeping precepts, as the initial path of practice for lay people to escape the 4 unfortunate realms. Today there was another guest, so the 4 holy monks at the right time paid homage to the Buddha, left the incense room, and went on their alms round. The Buddha continued to preach the Dharma. Knowing that Yasa's mind and intellect were ready, the Buddha summarized the 4 noble truths, emphasizing only the noble truth of the path to liberation from all suffering. Thus, as if millions of dark, empty nights had been lifted, Yasa seemed to have truly opened his eyes. A bright, pure, and clear sky suddenly spread out from behind the door of ignorance. In the dirty, smelly, and cramped mud of the mundane world, a pure lotus was slowly, humbly, and shyly blooming. Yasa had attained the Dharma eye, had pure faith, was unmoved by the path, and had entered the peaceful, blissful flow. Both grateful and moved, Yasa knelt down and hugged the Buddha's feet, choking with emotion, unable to speak. At noon, the 4 saints returned from their alms round, selected the best food, and brought it to the Buddha. After keeping their own portion, they also respectfully offered it to the venerable elder, Kondanya, and a reasonable portion to the rich and noble young man. Yasa was so moved, and at the same time a new joy filled his soul that he could only shed tears. How strange these foods were. This was the food of the saints, food obtained by the pure bare feet, by the refinement of long years of practice that had been kindly shared, so he ate them very carefully. For decades living in luxury and luxury, all the elaborate and rare foods and drinks from the forest and the sea were full of nutrients and delicacies. There was nothing Yasa had not eaten, yet he was fed up with them. But here, with only these ordinary foods, why were they so delicious? And when looking at the Buddha and the monks sitting cross-legged, with alms bowls in front of them, heads slightly bowed, the fingers of their right hands rolling the food, carefully, rhythmically, gracefully like the fingers of a musician skillfully stroking the strings, with no movement missing or extra, no gesture without mindfulness, Yasa understood and felt more that the Dharma and humanity are one. The Buddha and these holy monks have demonstrated the ultimate ideal of the Vedas, which no other holy Brahmin has been able to do, integrating the small self into the great self. However, the great self here is not a metaphysical unity of the universe, not an omnipotent personal God, not a mystical supernatural power, but it is more real, concrete, and has a more human life. In them, understanding and seeing, wisdom and awareness, knowledge and action, body and mind, are all lit up in a present moment of awakening, perfect and unified. As a young man with a solid foundation of knowledge, Yasa could understand and see another layer of the Dharma just by looking and thinking. What is hidden inside is revealed outside. Meanwhile, in the most luxurious mansion in the city of Varanasi, Yasa's parents were shocked to find Yasa missing. The mother was the first to discover him when she went upstairs to visit her son. She was extremely distressed, her hair disheveled, running back and forth, tears and snot streaming down her face. The father was also shocked when he heard the news, but he soon regained his composure and thought, beautiful women, parties, wine, sex, singing and dancing. For my son, it seems that he has long been bored. I see fatigue and lethargy in his eyes. I do not see him have a truly happy smile. He often sighs. His gait is no longer agile, exuding the vitality of youth, and he often looks far away somewhere at the end of the horizon. He told his servants, dozens of people were waiting around, waiting for his orders. You guys should scatter away from the city. Go search in the forests on the outskirts. Surely your young master is wandering somewhere among the mountains, in the quiet nature. Having said this, the servants mounted their strong horses and galloped away, and he himself set out at a brisk pace. Following his instincts, he mounted his two-horse carriage and headed towards Asapatana. At the point where his horses could no longer go, he walked along the path to the deer park. Near noon, the nimble steward galloped back in the opposite direction, holding in his hands a pair of velvet slippers embroidered with gold thread. It is the young master's shoes, my lord, that I found in the forest of the ascetics. The steward led the way. At noon, the forest was quiet, only the rustling of leaves, the innocent deer grazing, and occasionally a few birds chirping. The rich man felt his soul at peace again. Following the path, they came to the largest leaf hut, located between two ancient asatha trees with cool, green foliage. The Buddha was standing at the door. Yasa's father bowed to him, took out his shoes, and asked for news of his son. The Buddha knew about this and was waiting. Yasa was sitting next to him, but the Buddha used his supernatural power to hide it and said, "Calm down and sit down here, rich man. Then you will find your beloved son." Overjoyed, the rich man respectfully clasped his hands in greeting and then sat down quietly. The Buddha began to speak. He said that no one is without suffering, no one is without sorrow. The rich man was extremely wealthy, sitting on a pile of pearls, silver, gold, wealth, and property, but it was difficult to have a moment of peace and happiness, right? Day and night he lived in fear. Fear of being robbed, fear of fire and flood, fear of traitors, fear and suspicion of even his servants, fear of taxes and the erratic psychology of the king and his officials, not knowing when they would be falsely accused, framed, and have their property confiscated. Now his only son, who was loved and pampered like an egg on top of a pile of eggs, made him feel disappointed and sad. Why? What was the cause, rich man? The Buddha, like a bright moon, spoke slowly, and the rich man listened attentively. Occasionally, he looked up at the Buddha. Oh, this one is not a human being, and certainly not one of the wandering mendicants who are so common in the city. From his clothing, beard, hair, manner, gestures, and language, everything exudes a strange purity, nobility, and peace. Furthermore, he seemed to see through and clearly see my thoughts and worries. Oh, how right he was. I am not happy, that is for sure, but I dare not even say that to my wife and children. I am facing my own loneliness and nothingness. The Buddha read the rich man's mind, so he slowly opened it up. Starting from the present dukkha, the Buddha taught about the path that could lead to more peace and happiness, what creates cool, light, and refreshing mental states. So the Buddha only briefly talked about the noble truth of suffering, then taught more about the progressive dharmas, but developed them in a different way, more suitable to the rich man's capacity, level, and specific circumstances. After listening to the Dharma talk, thanks to his wisdom, the rich man attained the fruit of Shrodapana, the Dharma eye, and was extremely happy. For the first time in his life, he deeply experienced the strange transformation of his personality, from the way he looked at himself and life to the concepts of joy and suffering in the world. He was truly transformed. The meaning of the Buddha's Dharma talk was like a cool shower that washed away part of his suffering and sorrow. The Tathagata is the awakened one, the enlightened one. The Buddha said slowly, "He is a person who is not a person, nor is he part of the group of wandering ascetics, wandering around his hometown. The Dharma that the Tathagata teaches is not in the familiar religious tradition. It is the path that the Tathagata has discovered for himself. The Tathagata has liberated all afflictions, has understood, comprehended all minds, all scenes, all causes, all effects, all natures, all appearances, all conditions, all retributions of all sentient beings in the 3 realms and 6 paths. The Tathagata is a Buddha. One must understand it correctly." The rich man was shocked when he saw that the Buddha could read his mind, so he showed his submission. "Venerable Master, thanks to your grace and your wonderful teachings, my mind has been refreshed and I have seen the way. You have set right what was overturned. You have shown me what was hidden. You have shown the way to those who have lost their way. You have held a lamp in the darkness so that those who have eyes can see. May I take refuge in the world-honored one and in that Dharma." Furthermore, rich man, the Buddha said, "You must also rely on the holy Sangha of the Tathagata." All 5 arahants appeared from nowhere, sitting majestically, solemnly, and serenely around the Buddha. Frightened, he knelt down and prostrated himself. The Buddha then instructed the rich man on how to recite the refuge, and he became the 3rd layman and the first male attendant, Upasaka, to take refuge in the 3 jewels in the master's order. Now the rich man suddenly remembered that he had come here to find his son. The Buddha knew this. He withdrew his supernatural powers, and the young man Yasa was sitting next to him. Seeing his son again, he was both happy and sad. But strangely his soul had changed, and looking at Yasa's peaceful and serene face, he suddenly understood that his son had changed even more deeply than he had. And only the Buddha and the holy monks knew clearly that the young man had attained the fruit of Arhat after listening to the Dharma that the Buddha had thoroughly preached to the rich man. "My son," said the rich man, "your mother is suffering greatly. Come back to give her life." Yasa suddenly looked at the Buddha, understanding that Yasa wanted to become a monk, so he spoke up. "O householder, you are one who has seen the Dhamma, has taken refuge in the 3 jewels, has become a layman. Now think. Yasa, your son, is now a saint, an arahant, one who has forever severed all defilements and afflictions, living a life of liberation far from desires and existences. How can such a person return to a life beset by worldly pleasures? Like a bird that has escaped from its cage, would it ever want to go back into its cage? Like a man who has escaped from prison, would he ever want to go back into prison? Like an animal that has struggled out of the hunter's trap and wants to get back into the trap? Answer me, and Yasa will obey your knowledge and intention." Looking silently at the Buddha, the 5 holy monks, and Yasa, the rich man felt a peaceful, pure, and liberated space. Moreover, the Dharma he had just received and its aftertaste was still full, permeating his mind and heart. He deeply understood that Yasa had made the right choice, so he bowed his head. "Venerable world-honored one, my son has entered the pure path and cannot enjoy returning to the filthy mud. I have seen it. Then tomorrow, please invite the world-honored one, accompanied by the monks and Yasa, to my home so that I may have the opportunity to offer alms at noon." The Buddha accepted in silence. The rich man's servants sat and stood outside, crowded together. They helped the rich man, who seemed no longer sad, back home, while Yasa remained with the group of ascetics. They did not understand why, but did not dare to ask. Waiting for everyone to leave, Yasa knelt down at the Buddha's feet. "O world-honored one, please let me live in the holy Sangha." Sitting in the lotus position, the Buddha confirmed that Yasa was a bhikkhu, and then kindly admonished him, "Now live a holy and pure life for the happiness of gods and men." Turning to Kondanya, the Buddha said, "Yasa's appearance, robes, bowl, way of wearing robes, carrying bowl, 4 dignified postures, way of holding alms bowl, now are his responsibility, arranged and guided by him and his brothers." Then, the next morning, the 6 holy monks, the arahants, accompanied the Buddha leisurely to Varanasi, to Vyasa's family estate in the center of the city. The appearance and demeanor of the Buddha and the 6 holy monks, followed by Vyasa, were all intellectuals, with clean hair and beard, neat robes, and were also restrained, pure, and dignified. This was a new image, the first time in this capital of the Brahmin religion. People were constantly talking and gossiping. They gathered in small groups, quietly looking, curiously or pointing. Perhaps they discovered that Vyasa, the rich young man, the son of a wealthy family famous for his debauchery, was also among the group of monks. Red velvet carpets were laid out outside the door with foot-washing water. The servants stood by, dressed in colorful uniforms as if for a festival. Upon entering the house, seats were arranged carefully, cautiously, and elegantly. Vyasa's parents and Vyasa's main wife personally knelt down, welcomed, arranged, and prepared offerings and food. Occasionally, they would stop and look at Vyasa with mixed feelings of sadness and joy. Water for washing hands was in golden vessels. Hand towels were made of the finest silk scented with sandalwood. Fine, hard, and soft foods were carefully prepared. They were offered in bowls to the Buddha and the monks. They ate in silence. By chance, the Buddha's later Dharma period also brought the 2 ladies to the stream entry stage. With their pure and unshakable faith, the renunciation of Prince Vyasa became a joyful event in the family. And the 2 ladies also asked to take refuge in the Triple Gem, becoming the first 2 female attendants, upasika, in the Buddha's Sangha. A few days later, the event of Vyasa leaving home, following a group of monks of a strange religion, where a Buddha had just been born as a prince, created a great stir that stirred up the entire city of Varanasi and was widely discussed, especially among the intellectuals. A young man with a huge fortune, living in luxury, with 3 palaces, servants, and enjoying the pleasures of a small king, yet he waved his hand and left to live a life without a door or a home. That doctrine must have a strong attraction. That doctrine must have an extraordinary thought. Is that doctrine within tradition or outside tradition? Those questions created curiosity, attracting 4 young masters from other prestigious and wealthy merchant families. Vimala, Subahu, Punaji, and Gavampati, Vyasa's close friends, to come to Deer Park to ask about the Dharma. Then, after the wonderful Dharma period, all 4 princes attained arhatship, received the bhikkhu precepts, and followed the group of mendicant monks without returning to visit their families again. Not only that, the other 50 friends of the 5 were all elite and intellectuals scattered throughout the city and surrounding areas. Hearing the strange news, one after another came to seek them out, and they also attained arhatship, becoming bhikkhus who were indifferent to the life of the 5 desires, family, and worldly career. Dear ladies and gentlemen, you have just listened to the video about the life of Buddha Shakyamuni, adapted from the work A Life, a Sun and Moon by Master Geoy Duck. This video series will be broadcast at 7 p.m. every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday on the YouTube channel Buddhist Story. We sincerely thank you for watching. To not miss the next episodes, remember to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. If you find the content useful, please share this video with your relatives and friends. All your comments are very valuable to us. Please leave comments below the video so we can discuss and share together. Thank you, and see you again in the next episodes of the video series, The Life of Buddha Shakyamuni.